Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 18 of the e-novel, survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Sinking ships. Kevin Leahy knew one thing for certain from a vacation he had taken on a cruise ship years ago. That ship had sank off the Bahamas the first night out of port. He learned that on a sinking ship, although the crew and passengers may learn quickly and react appropriately, the rats are always the first to know for sure. He had been coming back from dinner that evening. The first night out of port, he had sat at the captain's table. He was, after all, the president of the largest oil and gas pipeline company in the world. It would have been odd for him to sit anywhere else. He had noted the captain's eyes had shifted left to right rather abruptly when the ship made an odd sort of lurch. The captain had skillfully excused himself from the table. Kevin did the same and headed to his stateroom. As he passed by an open hatch which led below decks, several rats had run by. He was amazed that there were even such vermin on a ship so modern as this, but also at how large they were. He was amazed further that they were not conflicted by the things the passengers or crew were. They did not weep or cry over the obviously sinking ship. They simply got out and left all of the problems to someone else. They had nothing invested in the ship, you see. Indeed, they came aboard at will despite efforts to keep them out. They took what they wanted while there, and when the ship finally sank, they scurried away and would probably survive better than anyone else. He thought of how similar the rats were to his investment banking friends, except they, the bankers, actually caused the ship to sink by stripping it of everything in sight. Otherwise, they were the same, scurrying away as soon as they knew the ship was sinking. The rats were unstoppable as they ran by. They appeared unafraid and quite determined. Some made their way into lifeboats. He knew from stories about ships he had heard that this was the sign the ship was indeed sinking. He did not hear or see anything, but rather felt air as though a blower was turned on, gently pushed up a wet smell from below decks. Shortly after this, a calm voice had called everyone to the deck, and people were placed in an orderly fashion into lifeboats. The ship had sank a few hours later. The rats had known the ship was sinking. Of course, everyone had, but their reaction was brilliant, the rats. Get out, take care of yourself, and worry about no one else. It was a truism. That was the very thing that Kevin had remembered when he decided to build the Eagle's Lair. He had used a frontman, an elusive and eccentric billionaire named L. Roger Eaton, who had put up most of the capital, but Kevin was the genius behind it all. He knew the ship, so to speak. In this case, the world was sinking, largely because he and his kind were sinking it by corrupt and reckless business practices. How could he stop? Even if he tried, it would do no good. His entire company and business, indeed the majority of his peers and competitors, were all playing a giant game that seemed to cross between roulette, fraud, and outright robbery. If anyone came forward and exposed the scheme, they and the rest of the world would collapse. So they had all played along to get along, and had all done quite handsomely in the process. It was only a matter of time before it did fall, and they all knew it. The more corrupt, the more fraudulent the company, the more they knew the ship would sink. The more eager they would be to buy into the idea of the lair. And of course Kevin was soaking them richly for it. They didn't care, though. The money they used wasn't theirs anyway. He laughed at that one. They had almost uniformly embezzled, stolen, or fraudulently obtained the money for the buy-in. Most had flown in over the past few months with very heavy suitcases, which Kevin knew had gold and precious stones and other tangible and secure assets in them. They were robbing the world blind as they escaped the sinking ship. Each home in the lair was built to the specifications of the owners, and each one had a large safe that was more secure than any Swiss bank. Kevin found that amusing. Leave it to a thief to be the one most worried about theft. He wondered how many billions in gold were sitting here in the lair. Was it perhaps the next Fort Knox? Now, though, he sat in the lounge of the clubhouse, sipping his whiskey and wishing they had put in that golf course. He had wanted to, but his planners had said that it would be too much water to keep irrigated properly. Too bad for that. He missed his games, more so because he had it on good authority that this was not about to be over any time soon. Rumors of disease and plague were confirmed by his sources within what was left of the government. Too many people were dying out there, and they had reached a sort of population tipping point that he knew meant many years stuck here in the lair. Many years of not engaging in his passion, the accumulation of wealth. It could be worse, though, he thought as he stood and headed outside. At least all of this meant a fresh start without having to hassle with things like the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, and other regulatory agencies. In the new economy, they would have broader power. He and his friends would rule. The government would be even more of a puppet one than it had been in the past. A true plutocracy would emerge as it should. Why should the fate of a nation be left to the uneducated masses? It belonged firmly in the hands of the most intelligent, those who had proven their genius by the accumulation of wealth. It may take several years, but when the day arrived, Kevin knew they would be ready. He walked by a pair of guards who greeted him briskly, enthusiastically, and professionally. "Good evening, sir," one of them said, and Kevin almost expected a crisp salute by that delivery. He loved having these ex-military men, but also hated the fact that they and the servants were so close by. He had thought of building a large wall between the servants' portion of the city and the members, but again his advisors had said it would be a security issue. As it was, the servant village was on the lowest and most dangerous side of the city, but putting a wall in would have made it impossible for the security to adequately watch over the members' homes and required more towers and therefore more personnel. While no expense had been spared, Kevin was also concerned that they had far too many servants here already and feared a rebellion as time went on. He knew tempers would get short, and some of the members were already becoming increasingly abusive. He had spoken to several of them personally and patiently pointed out that they could not simply fire these people. They were stuck with them unless their misconduct merited a one-way ride out. He slid behind the wheel of his electric cart and waved at some of the other members who were laughing and careening by him. Drunk again, he thought. He couldn't blame them. There was not much to do here, and especially nothing in the way of meaningful work. No companies to take over, no leveraged buyouts, no employee pension funds to raid, nothing but sitting idly. He parked the cart in the garage, and the butler, hearing the alert that he had pulled in, came out, opened the door into the house, and then plugged the cart into the cable charger. Inside, the maid was hustling his dinner to the table, and his wife would be joining him soon. Life would be boring, but they would manage somehow. Instinct. Standing with his feet in the stream as he scooped water to drink, Greg basked in the delicious coolness of the water as it trickled down his throat. He had been moving fast all day long for a number of reasons. For one, he was almost out of food and needed to resupply. For another, he had a feeling something was wrong. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something was making the hair stand up on the back of his neck. His instinct was that he was in danger, but he did not know from what or where. Not just general danger, but a malevolent force that was pushing on his mind. It wasn't from running out of drink either. That had been a rough several days, but now he was feeling somewhat normal, and even though he thought about quitting drinking. He knew, of course, that wouldn't last, that he would be back in the bottle as soon as he saw another one. One was too many drinks, and 100 drinks not enough. He also needed a woman, and all of that would be in the town ahead, or along the way, so he hoped. He had not seen a single sign of any kind of game. The area was overhunted. The woods were already picked clean, and that would probably mean no game for many years now. As much as he hated the game wardens and fish and wildlife officers, they had their place. They kept other people from poaching and hunting too much, which meant he would always have enough. Not so now, though. Still, he had a nagging sensation something was wrong. The last place he had been was easy, too easy. Greg had enjoyed watching the man die, hearing his pleading as he gasped and begged for mercy. He hadn't enjoyed it as much as the others, especially women, but it still made him feel powerful. He understood now what motivated other men to kill. It wasn't sexual, it was better. It was a feeling of a delicious power, that you were doing something few other humans had the stomach for. It also helped him feel in control, which at the moment did not feel so certain. He was being followed. That had to be it, but how did he know that? Had he smelled something earlier? Had he heard or seen anything? He would find out. He first broke off the trail and left very obvious but confusing signs that crossed back and forth on the trail. He then circled up and around onto a high ridge nearly 200 yards to the west into the sun. He would have the sun at his back but not be silhouetted when whomever was following found this sign. He would have a chance at a nice clean shot too. The man would have to look into the sun to see him, but his first indication would be a bullet through his chest. Greg picked a very comfortable position and set up his weapon, checked his range, and then waited. The rifle he had stolen earlier would have been better with its scope, but he had not checked the zero yet, and as slow as the man was, it might not even be accurate. He would use the AR-15 instead. It was well within range. The sun was moving towards sunset as Greg became sleepy. He set his rifle against a tree. He wanted to stay awake, but his eyes would not cooperate. Several times he caught himself dozing, but lacking self-discipline, he fell asleep anyway. The terminal. The cool morning air and sunshine did little to help Ox's mood. He had run out of whiskey and worse. The convoy was bogged down again. The roads this far north were usually free of cars because the snow had kept people from driving on them and abandoning their vehicles in huge snarls as they did in the cities further south. Unfortunately, every time they came to a major road junction or a town, they got tangled up in something. The scouts had found a way to traverse around, but one of the bus drivers had gotten stuck in the soft mud on the side of the road, and everyone was pushing it out. What lemmings people were, Ox thought, as he looked at the cars parked bumper to bumper, blocking both sides of the road for miles. It was easy to tell where Bangor was, though. Just walk on top of the cars. Bangor had burned. Riots and panic had swept through it. Ox had thought of diverting the convoy to the south. He had heard of the Hamptons and wondered how the rich folk were getting by. Probably no better than anyone else, he decided, and they had a mission, to get to Canada. They did not have unlimited supplies and could not afford to waste time or energy like they were right now. The convoy would take Colebrook Road exit and head north, skirting the city, but also would visit the rail terminal. Ox told the scout party to check it out, and there were hundreds of freight cars there, tankers and other rolling stock, as well as several dozen engines. The engines may have fuel in them, diesel fuel, and perhaps even something in one of the tankers as well. Ox had no illusion that they were the only scavengers, but sometimes you got lucky. Sometimes the others missed something. Ox had the scouts put observation on the rail yard, and they reported back that the yard was currently empty, and most of the cars appeared to have been looted already. The offices burned, but the locomotives and rolling stock appeared otherwise unmolested. Mitchell had left 2 men to occupy the rally point, equidistant between I-95 and the rail yard. The convoy would hold up there until dark, when they would move in and occupy the rail yard. With any luck, they might find more supplies. At the very least, it would be a safe place to bivouac for the night. Ox thought of perhaps commandeering a train, but realized he knew nothing about railroads and abandoned that idea as a pipe dream. They had to make Canada and would definitely need to forage on the way. Although he had not seen it, he knew people were right now planting crops on the farms, were raising animals, and this thought kept him focused on the objective ahead. Plowboy. Steve's hands shook in the brisk coal as he fumbled to start a fire in the wood gasification unit. Liz shone the small flashlight into the firebox, which helped, and he gingerly held some dryer lint over the match until it caught fire. On top of this, he placed small wood shavings and then some twigs. As the blaze grew, so did their spirits. Amazing how a fire did that, Steve thought. Soon they had a roaring blaze of wood chunks going in the firebox. "You're pretty good at lighting fires," Liz winked at Steve, and he took her in his arms and crooned, "Come on, baby, light my fire," in his best Jim Morrison imitation. "Keep that fire burning, dear, and I don't just mean the one in the tractor either," Liz said, giving him a playful swat on his butt as he let go of her reluctantly. "Al said that after we plow our fields, we need to let that fire die out in the tractor before we do the next ones." She winked. "I imagine we can find something productive to do while we wait." Steve smiled as he climbed onto the tractor. "Did Al really say that?" Liz grinned. "I confess he didn't, but it's the only thing I could come up with." Then she continued, "Kevin and Leroy will be at David's place helping them all day." Steve smiled broadly as she continued, "And that just means we will be all alone." She looked down at the ground coyly and drew a little arc with her toe and said, "I'll be waiting. Don't be all day." And then she turned and dashed toward the house. Steve fired up the tractor and set what must have been the world's record for tilling 4 acres before parking the tractor close to the house. He barely got through the front door, though. His wife had laid a clever ambush for him. Later, as they lay in bed, Liz twirling the hair on his chest with her finger, Steve asked, "Have you noticed Kevin has eyes for Linda?" Liz decided to play along. "Why, no, dear. Whatever do you mean?" Obliviously, Steve elaborated on how he had noticed Kevin looking like a lovesick puppy dog. Liz occasionally would say, "Uh-huh," so Steve would know she hadn't fallen asleep. Steve continued, "I know she lost her husband, know about the assaults, know she needs time, though. Maybe a year or 2. What do you think?" Liz gently grabbed a small handful of hair on his chest and tugged a little hard. "Good Lord, Steve, you men know nothing about love." She continued her lecture. "Linda needs time for sure, but she has already noticed Kevin, too. And guess what, dear?" Steve, being a wise husband, knew better than to answer a rhetorical question too quickly and waited. She said, "It won't be a year. Spring is here, after all." Now Steve was definitely in trouble. Had he missed something? Had he not paid attention? Yes, dear," he stammered, and she tugged at the hair on his chest a lot harder this time. "I swear you men are so thick. I predict we'll be hearing wedding bells by this time next year, probably sooner." She said with supreme confidence, "I think she is a size 7, too." She said this as if lost in thought. "Yes, a 7. Steve was now completely lost. What does her size have to do with anything? Slipping into her overalls, Liz said, "For the wedding dress, you oaf." Incredulous, she said, "What? Did you think she'd just get married in her overalls?" Turning now with her hands on her hips, she said, "Sometimes I wonder if that tractor out there knows more about romance than you men around here." Then she added with a smile, "How did you ever manage to get me into your bed anyway?" Steve finally had an answer. Marriage, he offered tentatively. Playfully acting angry, she spun on her heels with a huff and said, "Guess again, clueless one," and trotted down the stairs. Steve got dressed and headed back outside. There were more acres to till. Tomorrow, plants and seeds had to go into the ground, and they could afford no more delays. Growing season in Maine was intense, and their very lives now depended on these efforts. The devil's in the details. Sound travels a greater distance at night, especially a wet country night in early spring. Dirty and the snake knew this all too well and had tied burlap sacks around their boots to further muffle any noise they might make. Slowly and imperceptibly, they pulled away from their carefully selected observation post and moved back away from the lair. They still had another hard day ahead of them, another day and night of reconnaissance, and for the final piece they would need to traverse around and away from the lair. They had detected all manner of sensors and devices set well out into the woodline, some of them less than 100 yards from their current position, in fact. Dirty thought these people were more paranoid than a bunch of meth addicts, and after 2 days observing, he knew why. They had everything there. Nothing had been overlooked, from solar panels and generators down to a freaking country club with servants. Dirty had to shake his head at that one. Wow, talk about prepared. Most disturbing was the quality of the security element, which they had determined to be about 30 operators. Operators was a good word for it. The men all had the look of former Rangers, SF, or Marines about them. Probably well paid and hand-picked, of course. This would not be an easy takedown, and the Snake wondered frankly if the Fallen were up to the task. They could pull all their resources in and come up with maybe 100 soldiers at best. But when attacking a defender, that was scarcely enough. They would need more people for this job, would have to call in some other chapters. This, of course, made the deal less sweet because nobody wanted to consider that they might not live through the assault, through the takedown. Snake knew that if they did an assault, they would lose a good 50% of their people minimum, wounded or killed. It would make no difference. People didn't live long in this new world with wounds, not without medicine and doctors at least. These people, of course, had a doctor too, and a clinic. All of these details were noted carefully in their video, photographs and field sketches and notes. They needed to get the view from a different angle now to clarify things, and also to determine a couple of question marks about some parts of the compound not visible from where they were. The lazy way to traverse the perimeter would be to simply skirt around the edge at a distance. With the quality of troops and security, that was a death sentence, though. Thus, they would make their way back, perhaps 2 clicks, and then skirt well around the compound for another 8 or so to a location on some high ground that Snake had picked out earlier. It looked very thick and dense, but would give the angle they needed to see the rest of the compound and confirm many of the other key points noted. They were not just taking inventory of the place, though. They were also setting up likely avenues of approach and assault, and Snake had picked out 3 minor flaws in the defensive posture. One was the lights inside the compound. They gave a disadvantage to the compound because they were silhouetted in the night and had to look out into the darkness to see. Their night vision devices somewhat compensated for this, but not entirely. Another weak point was the thick division between the servants' quarters and the rest of the compound. This would be easy to isolate, and they could split the compound in half by pinning down the security element on this side and of the compound inside their quarters while they eliminated the guard towers in detail. The third weak point was the fact that the defenders were a bit too reliant on their high-tech equipment and had not put up hard barriers or sandbags. The towers appeared armored and concrete reinforced, but in between was nothing. It was obvious to both men why. They had chosen aesthetics over practical defense. This detail was noted carefully by both men. Essentially, the desire of the wealthy to be pampered and catered to was going to cost them all their lives, starting with the security force. Dirty wanted a cup of coffee bad right now, but they were on hard routine until the mission was complete, which would be 2 days away. After that, there was a small Esbit stove in the cab of the truck and a jar of real coffee and a real coffee pot. Dirty's mouth watered as he could nearly savor that flavor. He put this thought out of his mind, though. Right now they had a job to do against a very competent foe, and a screw-up here would equal death, just as when both men had served downrange. Helpers. Heading up the hill with the sunshine just cutting through the tops of the trees, rifles slung across their backs, Leroy and Kevin enjoyed the briskness of the cool morning. A good breakfast of some eggs and a little bread and coffee in them, they felt like they could conquer the world. Leroy and Kevin had become good friends over the past weeks. Kevin was young enough to be one of his sons, and he liked the man's spirit. Reminded him of himself when he was a young paratrooper headed to Vietnam. Today they would be helping David and Linda. Although the girl was very capable, she had asked Jacqueline and Liz if they could send a little help. Leroy had eavesdropped on the conversation. Liz had interjected that they would send Leroy up, and he noted with some amusement how Linda had said thank you, and would it be possible to, quote, also send Kevin. It seemed the fix was in, and everybody knew it except Linda and Kevin. Games within games, he thought. Leroy was glad too. Love was so hard to find in this world, and when it came your way, you were wise to take it for what it was. Besides all that, the two were really quite suited for each other, even if they weren't. A lot of options floating around for either lately. Leroy was not surprised when they arrived that Linda had fixed her hair just a bit, and she looked clean, fresh, and had a little glow in her cheeks. Her manner seemed aloof when dealing with Kevin. She probably was conflicted about the timing of it all, but still, she had taken the time to pretty up, and Leroy was very sure it wasn't for him or David. Leroy, would you help David, please? Linda began sweetly. He's up in the radio room working on the Clarion. Needs some help writing a few articles. Turning to Kevin with an obvious change of tone, she said, Kevin, you and I are going to plant as soon as Steve finishes tilling, while the ground's still soft. We need to get the furrows out. Leroy caught the pained look in Kevin's eyes at her businesslike tone with him. The contrast. He would set the young man straight later. The poor kid, he obviously knows nothing of women. Throughout the morning, Linda worked with Kevin, showing him how to do things. She was impressed by his stamina and more by how quickly he learned. He was gentle, too, like her Mark had been, and she tried to not think of him and feel so guilty when she did. She was confused and set herself about her work with all the more zeal and avoided talking to Kevin all day long, except when absolutely necessary. She felt bad because she could see how this hurt him. Not knowing what to do or how to fix things at the end of their labor, she brushed her hair from her face, then went over to him. Kevin, she began, not sure what she would say next. She reached over to touch his arm. He mistook the gesture and took her hand and shook it. Good job, Linda. Thanks for showing me so much today. Linda was taken aback because she was going to say something else. What that was, she had no idea. He paused for a moment, looking down at the ground, before abruptly turning and saying, See you at church tonight? Over his shoulder. She thought for a moment, then said, Yes, you will. That night at church, Kevin saw her again. She was quite beautiful, more so than before, and he presumed it was because she was wearing her Sunday best. He presumed wrong. Kevin was sitting with Leroy, Jacqueline, and Liz in their usual place. Linda came over to them, and Kevin tried not to look at her and was surprised when he felt her hand gently on his shoulder as she asked, May I sit with you, Kevin? Yes, of course, he sputtered, and slid over a little too hard against Liz, who was doing her best not to smile ear to ear. Leaning forward to speak around Kevin, Liz said to Linda, Dear, are you a size 7? Linda thought for a moment at this odd question before answering, No, I think I'm a 6 lately. And then the pastor came to the pulpit, and everyone stood to sing. Not sure of what to think, Kevin stood and picked up the hymnal. There was one for every person, but he noted that Linda stood close to him and shared his. His mouth went dry and he could hardly sing, but did his best, wondering what to make of all this. Liz bumped gently against him, and when he looked at her, she gave him a wink. He blushed and also shook a little. He just knew he was going to screw everything up. Oh, no, he thought. I didn't even put on deodorant. He wished he could rewind and go back to the afternoon. He would have showered a bit better and looked down at his hands and noted they had dirt under the fingernails. Nervously, he shifted his fingers so Linda would not see them. If this woman ever speaks to me again after tonight, it will be a miracle, he thought to himself. Sloppy. I walked briskly down the trail, scanning from side to side, and stopped periodically to listen and to smell. I was getting tired and figured the man I was tracking was feeling about the same. I knew I had a couple of advantages, though. One was that I had been eating better lately and still was. My freeze-dried rations were picked deliberately for their high value in nutrition. The other was that I was in better shape. This man was overweight a bit and also had a drinking problem. I had found his empty bottle earlier, thrown into the stream carelessly. He had been nursing it. I could tell because it was well worn for such a small disposable bottle. It was also bone dry and had even been washed out with water. He was an alcoholic, all right, and now he was most likely doing without. Alcoholics need alcohol to function. When they don't get it, their bodies go through withdrawal symptoms. This can seriously impair their ability to think, to judge, and to function. I knew a lot of them in the military and knew what the man was experiencing and would use it fully to my advantage. Ahead, I saw something and moved quickly to investigate. It was a sign, finally, but something was wrong. It was too obvious. Suddenly it hit me. A trap. I quickly ducked behind a tree on the side of the trail, downhill, and got prone. My body tingled as I half expected a bullet to punch into me at any second. I shook with the anticipation. I felt as if someone were aiming a rifle at me this very moment and would put one right between my eyes. I wished now I had been more careful, wished more for camouflage, for better cover. After what seemed an agonizing eternity, I peered uphill and began scanning with my binoculars. I was looking for anything man-made, any straight lines, anything that might glint or sparkle. I knew I would not see it, though, but it was my training to look anyway. I half expected each time I looked up to be shot, but I heard nothing. The man had left some obvious sign up ahead, not as obvious as a trail marker, but still obvious scarring and displacement. He had broken a tree branch and also knocked over several rocks, exposing their dirty side to the sky. A blind man could have seen this, and that is where he messed up. He was a little too obvious, too eager to leave this sign, left too much of it. That told me only one thing, that he was right now watching me. He might be waiting until I perhaps moved just a bit more, exposed a bit more of myself, had only refrained from shooting me because he had, not shot yet, but I did not know why. I scanned what I could with my binoculars, looking where I would be hiding if I were him. I started up the slope, but not at the military crest, not where I would be silhouetted. I stayed as low as possible and was methodical. Eventually, there, leaning against a tree in plain sight, I saw something. I adjusted the focus and saw the distinct silhouette of an AR rifle with some sort of scope. Another ruse? I placed a stick on the ground, pointing at the rifle from my position. If I lost sight of it, it would narrow it down for me in this dense forest a bit. I scanned left and right, but saw nothing. Was he using that rifle as bait? I knew he had Eddie's rifle that had a scope on it. I didn't remember what kind he had, but had to presume it had the range that the man might be lining up on me with. How tragically ironic that he would use a friend's weapon to shoot me with. I continued to scan, though, careful to not reveal too much of myself, half expecting to feel the slam of a bullet into my body at any second. I was certain this was my man. It had to be him. I felt it rather than knew it. I felt his malevolent presence, his evil. It made me angry. It made me nervous. It made me feel very uncomfortable. I had felt this before in combat too. You could feel the enemy sometimes. I could not describe it, but other vets told me the same thing. Sometimes it's the lack of ambient noise or activity. In villages, if the children were not outside during the day, that was sometimes an indicator. An open window on a freezing cold day, a man wearing a coat on a hot one. Things you sometimes didn't notice right away took on a tremendous significance when in combat. Now my senses were running in overdrive, and something told me that this rifle belonged to the man I hunted. I thought of trying to shoot and hit the rifle. It was just over 200 yards, and with my ACOG I could do it. It might take me several shots, though. He might be expecting that, though. My mind was racing too fast. I had to stop and think. I took in a deep breath slowly for 4 seconds through my nose, held it for 4 seconds, then released slowly for 4, and I did this 4 times. After this, my pulse went back to normal, and I began to think much more clearly. The man I hunted was not a professional soldier. He may not have the discipline I did, but he had skills and was cunning. He might be asleep. He might have laid a clever ambush. I learned long ago to never underestimate an enemy, and this one had proven to be as vicious as he was cunning. I saw a movement and put my rifle up to my shoulder and easily saw the man reaching for the weapon. He was moving casually, slowly, as if he had just woken up. That was it. He had been asleep. If I had known that, I would have moved in and scooped him up already. Now, though, I had him in my sights, but I was conflicted. He was dangerous. Taking him in alive would be risky, and I was under no real obligation to do so. I could simply shoot him and be done with it, but what if this wasn't the man? I would need further proof. The man looked around for a bit and then settled in and focused his attention back on the trail. I was about 20 yards from his deliberate markings, and now I was stuck. If I moved, he might see me. I would have to wait. He settled down with his back to the tree and put the scope rifle into his shoulder and began scanning. I slowly and carefully slid backwards down the hill behind a thick maple tree and remained there, listening and waiting. I resisted the urge to fall asleep, and it became all the more powerful as the sun came up in the sky and the hours went on. The wind rustling the leaves gently around me did not help. I thought of happier times, thought of my farm, and this made it harder. I shifted my attention, therefore, to horrible images, the mutilated body of Eddie. That angered me and stirred me awake. I also prayed now earnestly for God to help and guide me. After a while, I looked to my right and noted a depression in the ground that led to a steep cut from water erosion. The cut ran down the hill for several hundred yards. That was it. I slid down on my stomach with my rucksack on my back. It was painful and hard, but it was also downhill on top of last year's leaves. I was dirty and slimy, but that would add to the camouflage. I got down into the revetment at the bottom and then walked briskly until I was well away from the man's position. At the bottom, I saw a saddle to my left in the hilltop and moved swiftly up this and crested the ridge. I was now on the far side of the ridge over from the man. I could see the trees that he was hiding under with my scope, but could not see his form just yet. He was a bit on the other side. I moved quietly and swiftly, noting that the wind was blowing into my face from his position. He would not smell me, and any sound I made would not be blown his way, but blown the opposite direction. I stopped and checked my weapon, sliding the bolt back just a fraction to ensure I had a round in the chamber of the rifle. I next checked my pistol by pulling the slide back just a fraction until I could see brass, meaning I had a round in the chamber there as well, putting it back in my holster on my chest rig. I grounded my rucksack quietly, said a prayer, and then moved in slowly and deliberately to where I knew the man was, half hoping that I would have to kill him. This has been Chapter 18 of the survival novel Enovel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tune in next week for Chapter 19.